From the beginning of Montana's distinctive yet troubled history, the Treasure State was dominated, both economically and politically, by powerful outside interests who shipped in capital and bought control of the state. Historians tell us that as the Anaconda Company and its friends ran Montana, economic and political power flowed out into the hands of distant capitalists and corporations. Policy was determined in far-off New York City, and control of the press was rigid. Anaconda's corporate dominance in Montana's political affairs was unique in American history. For its first 75 years, Montana was a one-company state. But then big winds of change roared across the Treasure State. Between 1965 and 1980, Montanans ripped off their copper collar, transforming Montana from a corporate colony into a free, modern state. The people finally controlled their own destiny. The pitched battle between the people and the established power structure was not easily won, but fired in a crucible of change. A new Montana was born. Join Evan Barrett and real history makers of the time as they shine a light on this remarkable era.
Welcome back to In the Crucible of Change. You know, as we're approaching the end of our series here, we're starting to take a look back at the period. This was the second, what we refer to as the second progressive period in Montana history. The first being from about the turn of the 20th century for about the first 15 years or so. And then this period of progressive change that occurred between 1965 and 1980, the period we call In the Crucible of Change. And as we approach the end of the series, we're starting to look back a little bit and reflect upon what that period meant. And so today we're having a chapter we're calling Back to the Future. And it's a look back at the second progressive era after 40 years from a couple folks that were in the middle of it and have stayed active in government and politics since then in a way that gives them a good sense of perspective on the whole thing. So I want to welcome a couple special guests here. First is Hal Harper. Hal is the former Speaker of the Montana House of Representatives, but we all know Hal for having served 26 years in the legislature. Glutton for punishment, one might say, but you actually were there during some times when a lot of stuff really got done. And I would say that both these guests come from political families in a way. Your father, the renowned Reverend George Harper, was a Constitutional Convention delegate. And then right after he was in the Constitutional Conventions when you started your legislative career.
Well, and Evan, he was one of the independents in the Constitutional Convention, so I guess I was a little confused.
Which is why you started.
I was a Republican for 2 sessions and then a Democrat for a number after that. Yeah. But anyway, proud of my father.
Yeah. And after you were essentially termed out, you became the Chief Policy Advisor for Governor Schweitzer, where we worked together for about 6 years. Of course, we've been good friends for all these years, and it's always a pleasure to have you here. You're retired now, right?
Well, I am.
And a renowned fly fisherman is what I hear. So,
well, don't forget that the best fisher person is the one that enjoys it the most.
There you go.
That's the only qualification.
And you enjoy it.
So I'm in there.
Hal's being joined by Anne Mary Dusseault. Anne Mary Dusseault, again from a political family, and a very unique distinction. You know, her father, Eddie Dusseault, was the Senate Majority Leader in 1965, and you were the House Majority Leader in 1979. It's the only time in Montana history that thing ever happened, a multi-generational leadership team like that. So it's a compliment to your family's style and your involvement in politics, government, public service. Anne Mary served 4 terms in the legislature from starting with the 75 session. You were Majority Leader in 79. You then were active in local government. 12 years as a county commissioner in Missoula County, is that right?
That's correct.
Now retired, but a renowned bridge player, I understand.
Well, I don't know about renowned, but I'm trying to earn a new craft as I age, so that's it.
Anyway, thank you both for joining us in the Crucible of Change. This is a this look back is very important to give a sense of perspective about what was happening. We've gone through a series of chapters and episodes that deal with the specifics of all kinds of things that happened. And we want to take kind of a looking back and overview, and I want to kind of make the point that though we have arbitrarily drawn the lines and said the Crucible of Change period started in 1965, and a lot of it had to do with the weakening and the eventual demise of the Anaconda Company as both not only just a political power but an economic power. It eventually died away. And a lot of that was going on during this period, but the real launching point for serious stuff happening began with the election of Forrest Anderson as governor in 1968. Because after 16 years of Republican governors and 40 years of a tightened copper collar around Montana, there was a breaking out that occurred, and Forrest's election in 1968 against an incumbent governor, Tim Babcock, really set the stage for the legislature to be able to be proactive and make things happen, and for a constitutional convention. And then closer to your time was the election of Tom Judge, because Forrest was a one-term governor, was the election of Tom Judge against Ed Smith in 1972 and his re-election against Bob Woodall in 1976. So between Forrest and Tom, that was 12 years of Democratic governors right in the center of this period of change. And then you guys were in the legislature working with them, essentially. A lot was happening, plus the con-con. We can't ever forget that. So I wanted to mention that these elections made a difference, but the legislature, which normally is split, Democrat-Republican, starting about 73, became Democratic on both sides of the aisle for almost 4 sessions in a row. How did you feel about working in that kind of an atmosphere where Democrats had both houses and a governor?
Well, first of all, in 73 and 74...
First time you were on the other side of the aisle, of course,
Yeah.
first time.
Those were annual sessions. The only time Montana ever had annual sessions. The people got rid of them right after that. But I was a Republican, and I was also the secretary of the Republican caucus, but I really liked what I saw going on from the body as a whole. And I was in awe of people like Dorothy Bradley, and there was a woman named Polly Holmes, and Tom Tao, and different people like this. Max Baucus, that was his first term. Mike Greeley, people like this were in there, and I was very interested in what they were doing, because what Montana seemed to be doing to me at that point in time was sizing up where it was and what it needed to do to get ready for the future. Now, don't forget, those were the times when the people of Montana had discovered that there were any number of power plants, coal-fired power plants, planned for the state of Montana. We were to be the boiler room of the nation, is what some feared.
Projected 70-some plants, yeah.
And that's when we started thinking, is this going to be the future of Montana? And you know, that's the same question that people ought to be asking themselves today. What is going to be the future of Montana? But
so you're thinking that the one of the hallmarks of this period was its ability to adopt things that that set a stage for how Montana would look for many years?
That's exactly what people were thinking. Some people were panicked when they saw the plans that looked like energy department plans that said, we're going to power the whole nation. And we thought, well, we better slow down and take a look. I remember Dorothy Bradley carried a bill a little bit later to provide a moratorium on strip mining of coal. And that bill, tied or failed by one vote?
It was a tie vote.
That's exactly what it was.
But it was held as a ransom, and it was held in abeyance, so a bunch of other things passed.
It was one of the greatest debates I ever saw. And it was a debate that needed to take place. But once again, you know, there were national events that helped formulate this progressive period. You know, go back to 1962 is when Rachel Carson published her book, Silent Spring. And that's when the nation began to see, I think, that not everything that the corporations told you was true about what they were doing.
I
Okay.
am shocked.
Okay. And you would be now. But back in those days, and people realized things needed to happen. People realized that Montana was endowed with beautiful trout streams, and it was later in the 60s, a Kalispell legislator named Murphy passed the first really environmental river bill establishing 12 blue ribbon trout streams.
Well, and then the whole notion of wild and scenic rivers,
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
which was also a new concept. at
Well,
the
we
time.
might as well dive right in. So it seems like we've moved toward the environmental, natural resource area to talk about. And that was a major area of change during this period.
One of the
So
areas,
let's
yes.
dive into that. We have a lot of subject matters to take care of, but that one, the environmental legislation that passed during this period has set the tone for Montana since that time, even though there's been some erosions here or there, but it set the tone. There was a wide range of things that happened. The Major Facility Siting Act. Let's take, for example, the Montana Environmental Policy Act,
Okay.
which I want to point out was sponsored by George Darrow.
Who was a Republican.
Speak to the issue a little bit of Republicans working on environmental stuff together with Democrats in those days. It's a bit different than today.
His bill passed, I believe it was the House unanimously, one of the chambers. He was a senator. He was a Republican senator, and his bill established the Montana Environmental Policy Act. It also established the Environmental Quality Council. So all of a sudden, the legislature of the state of Montana, that had been traditionally very weak in the interim before, had a council to study environmental matters, composed of equal numbers of Republicans and Democrats. And that was a great breakthrough. The Water Policy Act was passed in '73 when we began to try to quantify all the water in the state of Montana. We are still at it, by the way, folks.
I would mention that with George Darrow being a Republican, and I think that Harrison Fagg sponsored the Hard Rock Mining Bill and a couple other Wild and Scenic Rivers Bill. He was a Republican out of Billings. That this was a period, by the way, when the Environmental Protection Agency was created federally under Richard Nixon.
Richard Nixon, that's right.
People forget about that because today, if you utter the word environment in a Republican convention, they'll run you out the door. But it was different back then.
To a degree. Now,
Yeah.
let's be honest. Not many Republicans strayed away from the kind of voting that the Montana Power Company or the Anaconda Copper Company would like to see. There were a few. You mentioned these two, especially Harrison Fagg, who carried the Wild and Scenic Rivers Bill for the state of Montana. Someone burned his cabin down while he was sponsoring that bill.
As retribution for his.
We assume.
Well, we're pretty darn sure, I think.
And there have been some great heroes like that. But I think a number of groups should get credit for this new awareness, this new environmental awareness. People didn't call them environmentalists back then. In fact, that's a term that I think came about a number of years later. There were no environmental movements. It was only, I think, the National Wildlife Federation.
They were conservationists, weren't they?
Maybe had one lobbyist, the National Wildlife Federation. And it took a while, but these were all citizen groups that were working together.
And one of the things going on at the same time was in the early 70s and at the time of the implementation of the new Constitution, all those activities brought the public participation into the process in an unprecedented level. Government was more open because of open meetings. The legislative process was more open. Citizen groups, I think, felt that they had a place at the table, and they certainly used it. And whether they were citizen lobbyists or citizen groups who felt that they could access their individual legislators, because remember too, at that same time at least in 1975, we moved from countywide elections to elections of legislators from single-member districts. That brought that individual legislator in a very close relationship to their constituency. And so I think this whole notion of citizen activity, citizen involvement, citizens believing they had a voice and using that voice was pretty profound during that period of time.
You know, when you mentioned citizens participating, it's worth noting that the Montana Constitution provided a right of participation, which I believe is unique in the United States even to this day. Open meeting laws adhere in a number of states, open government laws, open records laws, but Montana is the only one that adopted a thing that said you have a right to participate as a citizen. And I think that makes Montana unique. But it also was unique to this period, you know, this period of change that was going on. Now, now we talked about the open government thing. The press changes are part of that, because it had to have open government but not have a free open press, a active press, a proactive press, doesn't do you a lot of good, because not everybody can come to Helena and find out what's going on. So it's got to be reported to them. And the hallmark of that, of course, occurred slightly before this period of change, but was in 1959 when the Anaconda Company divested itself of virtually every major statewide paper. Most people don't realize today that prior to 1959, with the exception of the Great Falls Tribune, every major daily in the state of Montana was owned by the Anaconda Company. Mm-hmm. Now there's a scary proposition. Mm-hmm. And so part of the removal of the copper collar and this opening of government and the opening of participation and awareness started with that divesting of those things, which brought people like, take in Missoula, where you were from, the Missoulian had all of a sudden the editorial stance was different.
That's right. That's right. I would call it progressive, though I don't know that that's what the editor was. Sam Reynolds, and I don't know what he would describe it as, but there was a very clear, maybe populist voice, and that was probably in contrast to the corporate voice. And I think there were a number of newspapers in Montana that, both large and small, I'm thinking of the Ravalli Republic and other smaller newspapers, where they took the voice of the public, the populist voice of the time, and really put that forward. It was wonderful.
Well, you know, prior to that, you had these little pockets like if you were a progressive or a liberal, or if you were oriented toward labor or rural populism, you had to put your $5 up and get an annual subscription for $5 to the People's Voice, which came out every week. And that was the only independent analysis, because, well, again, with the exception of the Tribune again always was a family newspaper,
right,
kept separate. But that's a big deal to have that an independent editorial voice, and then to start to have reporters who, with the open meeting laws and the open records laws, suddenly have something to report. Again, worth noting is, for example, the Constitution requiring that every vote of the legislature that had any meaning at all had to be recorded. Prior to that, you know, when the committee went into executive session, they really meant executive session. They meant close the doors, all of you get out of here, all you citizens get out, all you newspaper people get out. We'll sit in here and we'll make the decisions, and when we open the door, we'll tell you what we did.
First session I served, the new Constitution had not been implemented. And I was on a committee called Constitution, Elections, and Federal Relations.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
And we were supposed to implement the Constitution. We met in that little room up to the right in front of the House of Representatives. There was not enough room
for anyone
to get in and see. And we just sit there and sort of muddle until John Hall came in and decided what we were going to do on some of those things. But that was the beginning. That was the beginning. Now, of course, these days, citizens aren't even allowed on the floor of the House, and so I don't know how they would do that.
Well, that's just that meeting, but citizens are not just allowed, but encouraged to participate in the committee processes. Although I tell you, when someone has governmental power, and I don't think it's exclusive to government, people like to preserve their power, whether it's corporate power, government power, or whatever. They tend to want to consolidate it, protect it, and people having opinions is bothersome sometimes. But that's democracy, isn't it? And we have a real strong democratic system here in Montana. Mm-hmm. Tell me about, let's talk about that legislature. And you mentioned single-member districts. Mm-hmm. Tell me how your sense, as someone who first ran under single-member districts, the difference between what it was like if you had to run countywide versus what was the result? What was the difference?
Well, I think your viewers can imagine. And they may not know, in fact, that in the olden days, before the Constitution, anyone who ran for the legislature ran county-wide.
Or, by the way, in rural Montana, eventually, sometimes multi-county districts.
Sometimes multi-county districts, that's correct.
That's right.
Yeah.
From Helena, we ran in 3 counties, Lewis and Clark, Broadwater, and Jefferson. And there was only one Democrat elected during that slot. Of course, I was a Republican, and that was Barbara Bennett.
Barbara Bennett, right.
And she was the only one elected.
But there was, that whole system put it made it far easier for people with name recognition to get elected. So like in Missoula County, for example, and I'm sure this was duplicative around the state, is, you know, if you were a Dusseault, a Dusseault, a Flynn, you know, a Toole, you know, a family name from the area, you were going to become a member of the legislature almost by acclamation, because you were all on the same ballot, and anybody who weren't those names fell out at the bottom. Single member districts, which came with the new Constitution, basically said every person has a vote. It's I think the language is one man, one vote, but it's one person, one vote. So, and they broke the districts down into much smaller units. The net result of that, in looking back, is the diversity in the legislature increased exponentially. You could see changes in the number of women who were elected, the number of Native Americans who were elected, and the number of other ethnic minorities that were elected. And it also created, because you were elected by a group of maybe 3,000 people, you actually went door to door and talked probably to 2,199 of those people during the course of a campaign. So you had a much closer relationship.
There's a radical idea, actually being connected to the voter.
Isn't that awesome?
You know, and so we have that with the single-member districts, and that is something that we didn't have. Let's talk about the women in the legislature, and before we go into women generally. Taking a look at it, but prior to the Constitution, in the 65 session, there were 3 women out of almost 150. In 67, there were 3 women. In 69, there was 1. In 71, there were 2 out of almost 150 legislators. And then the Constitutional Convention hit, and there were 19 women in the Constitutional Convention. And it kind of broke the mold.
Yeah, but we know why, right?
There are probably a lot of factors, but do you have some ideas on that?
Well, I think the primary factor was the participation by the League of Women Voters. And the League was very instrumental in getting the Constitutional Convention convened. And then a number of those women ran and were elected as Constitutional Convention delegates. And I haven't looked at each of the 19 persons, but I would bet that 75% of them were League of Women Voters. And remember, they were a nonpartisan group, even though they ran with a party label for the CONCON. They viewed themselves as people very interested in good government, representative government, and strong government for the public.
So
my
now let me advance an additional reason that goes with that, because I think that's very much the case. You look at it as Dorothy Eck, You look at Lucille Spear and Daphne Bugby and Arlene Reichert and
Jean Bowman,
and the list goes on.
And the list goes on.
That folks who were clearly active in the effort through the League of Women Voters to modernize, to get a new constitutional called, to modernize through executive, modernize the legislature, have a new executive branch structure through executive. These are things that, from a quote good government perspective, women were very active in, and then suddenly they said, let's run. But one of the things that happened was the basic power structure often of the communities was represented then by who was in the legislature. The Supreme Court, following what the 1889 Constitution said, ruled that sitting legislators could not run for the Constitutional Convention. So the field was much more open to get in there and get elected. Multi-county districts, again. I mean, you had like 18 people running for 9 slots in Missoula. And yet the field was more open because the traditional leaders that you thought would just jump in there and do it were told by the Supreme Court, no, you can't.
You can't.
So with the open field and the League of Women Voters activity, suddenly almost 20% of the Constitutional Convention was women. By the way, we don't suffer from, the more women we have involved in the legislative process or any other process, frankly, I think we're better off we are. We men do not succeed. You know, we've helped make a lot of mess in this world, you know, when men have been in charge, I can tell you that. Well, but if you look at it, we went from 19 in the con. In 73, it went up to 9 in the legislature, then to 14, 15. So after that, it's only gone up from there. We're in the 20. I think we got 40 now, don't we, in total between both parties?
And I think what those numbers show is that people were thinking differently about when they voted for the con people, because you had 6 independents. How many independents do you have in the legislature each year? You don't have hardly any.
1 or 2.
Once in a while.
Constitutional party candidate or something like that. So they elect a bigger slate of women than ever before in history, and they elect independents. People were ready to see something happen. And it's amazing this Constitution even passed. It was very, very close. But, you know, without the strong support,
2,500 votes.
Without the strong support of certain formerly thought of partisan people like Betty Babcock, this would not have passed.
That's true.
My father gives her absolute credit for helping pass this Constitution.
That's the spouse of the former Governor Tim Babcock, who was a Republican, who almost broke ranks in a way of being a strong leader in the ratification of the Constitution, which was ratified by only 2,500 votes. Of course, people were rallied by your father, who came up with the phrase, "Praise the Lord and pass the Constitution."
That's right.
And that was a well-known bumper sticker around Montana at that time, wasn't it?
And he and Betty would even travel together and give joint presentations that I was able to witness when I was sort of tagging along.
Did that inspire you?
Well, it did, because it was. I started running. I was running in that 1972 time period, and little did I know it would be Betty Babcock that would end my tenure as a Republican, but she certainly did that in a big way.
She took you out of the Republican primary in 1974, and you came back in 1976 as a Democrat and stayed until past the year 2000.
Betty Babcock was my dear friend.
Yeah, and it was sad to see her passing.
Very good, very much.
You know, the women's issues were important too. We were talking about women. Equal Rights Amendment is an interesting thing that was a big cause during the 1970s, but it did pass when the Federal Equal Rights Amendment was passed in 1972. It was rapidly endorsed by the Montana legislature in 1973, partially because we essentially had embodied it in our own Constitution. What we passed in 1972 gave women strong rights, full rights under the Montana Constitution. And so it was pretty easy to say, well, let's just endorse this federal thing. But then a battle royale ensued about folks coming and wanted to rescind that. And you were there for some of that, weren't you?
National, Phyllis Schlafly and National Movement.
National Forces came in.
Eagles Forum. And No, it was hard fought. It seemed like for a number of sessions.
Yes.
Well, over and over.
As I remember, but it was just one of those things where you're not making much progress here, guys, and just another one of those things that diverted the legislature's attention and probably caused some partisan wounds.
So, but women under the Constitution with their rights, there were a lot of legislative things happened that eliminated different forms of discrimination for women in different parts of society. They were protected by our Montana Constitution. That was part of it. Obviously choice became an issue, women's wanting to have control over their own medical decision making regarding their bodies and so on. That passed during that period in a lot of ways in the Montana legislature.
Well, I remember, since it was I that carried the bill to conform Montana's law to Roe versus Wade, which happened in 1973, I guess, in February.
So you carried it in
I
74.
carried the bill. I think I carried that in 1973. That's what I remember. The first bill I ever carried. Montana's law was nearly identical to Missouri's, and I thought there's no way the legislature could refuse to pass this bill, and that's what I was told. But what we saw is the legislature will do what the legislature wants to do. And that law basically remained unchanged and remained on the books the way it was. In fact, was strengthened. It's probably still on the books, for all I know.
Little
Now,
did you know how much influence
judges
you
and
had.
courts accorded women and doctors the privilege they had been seeking. But it was never in state law that way.
Now, let's swing a little bit over to something in the progressive era that made a difference was workers. Workers' rights. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, yeah.
Before we do that, I think it's important to just to say that during the interim after the passage of the new Constitution, there was a legislative study on implementing the equality part of the new Constitution, that provision. And there were actually, I don't think I'm going to exaggerate, there were a lot of bills. And I'm going to say maybe even there was a package of them. Do you remember that? Oh, you weren't there in 75.
I wasn't there.
You were there, but there was maybe a package of 20 or 30 and maybe even 40 bills that it took to fully bring Montana's laws into basically a gender neutral position. And it had everything to do from property, owning property, divorce, inheritance. I mean, just every basic legal tenet in the state was made gender neutral, except for one, this is one of my favorite stories, which had to do with a woman's ability to cut men's hair. And that was the one bill in that whole package that did not pass. And it was basically...
A woman had to be a cosmetologist, but you couldn't be a barber.
But you couldn't be a barber, but you could cut a man's hair as a secondary service. Now go figure what the heck that meant. But of the entire package, and it was very profound, that was the one bill that, at least in 1975, did not pass.
Well, given the history of what I had experienced working with the Barbers Board when I was first working in government, working in trying to put them into reorganization.
Men's hair is genetically different, did you know that?
And you know, it goes to the almost a law of public administration that I sorted through when which was the smaller one's area of authority is, the more jealously they guard it.
Absolutely, without
And
any,
so
without
the
any
barbers
question.
were guarding their little area of authority.
And it was a grand fight between the barbers and the cosmetologists.
A lot happened, but Montana was leading the way with strong women's rights issues right in our own Constitution, with more legislative women that were fighting for those, along with progressive men that wanted to go do it as well. Now, on the labor front, let me stay on the legislature for one more second. Let me ask you a little bit about the tenor of the legislature and maybe today versus then in term limits. Your thoughts on because something that was not in the Constitution was term limits. It was later put on. And has that made a difference in the legislative operations as opposed to what you saw in the 70s, which was a progressive period, and yet there was no term limits?
Well, I will tell you that the change from then to now breaks my heart. And I mean that totally sincerely. And I don't want to get caught in just how things were so much better in the past. But as there were hundreds of times when we would work across the aisle with our counterparts of the other party to achieve legislation of significance to the state of Montana. We could stand up and debate on the floor of the House or the floor of the Senate and have a good debate and yet walk away with respect for the other person. I think we have lost a lot of that capacity. That was almost more the norm than unusual, and I think now it's turned around, that it's more unusual to have that kind of cooperation. And I feel bad for the state, and I feel bad for the legislature. A lot of it has to do with term limits, but also a lot of it has to do, I think, with the media. I think a lot of it has to do with kind of the polarization that exists in politics today.
Mm-hmm. Let's kind of hit the term limit thing a little bit, though, in this, because I agree with what you've said, for sure. There's a lot of things that lead to it, and admittedly, we used to see battles tooth and nail over policy.
Absolutely.
But afterwards, you wanted to go have a drink or a cup of coffee and get ready for the next day to fight again, but we were fighting over policy differences, it was never personal. Very seldom. Now, what did term limits allowed people to get to know each other, didn't it?
Well,
before there were term limits.
You know, I think Anne Mary's characterization is accurate. It's not all black and white. I mean, there may be an upside of term limits. It did put some new blood in. Now, you can question how beneficial that's all been, but by and large, what she says is true. It meant that you're not going to be there for very long. I mean, I must have been in there 6 sessions before I even chaired a committee. Mm-hmm. I think you've had speakers of the House that may have been doing their second or third session these days, and this is very complicated business. The legislature has been struggling for a long time to be an equal branch of government. And term limits was very much a step backwards in that regard. And once again, the people that were lobbying against term limits said, who will not be term limited? The lobbyists. And that has certainly been the truth.
Essentially, legislators are less experienced, and lobbyists and bureaucrats can be as experienced as you want to be.
Well, they're much more experienced. In fact, many of them, if you went up there today, are ex-legislators that got term limited because they're the ones that know the situation. But since they're working...
the lobbyists. You're talking
the
about
lobbyists, yeah. To a certain, but they're working for a certain principle or principles, and they're not likely to tell you everything they know, which may be in the best interests of the state. And I hate to say that about some of my old colleagues, but it has not been good. Single-member districts can turn out a person anytime they want to. You should have left that kind of term limit to the voters. But I'm not ready to pin everything wrong on term limits because I don't think it is.
There is a new blood thing that does happen, so there's always a lot of gray in this stuff. Let's talk about education. This period saw an infusion of money, new programs in K through 12, equalization, restructuring the university system. Let's talk a little bit about what did education improve during this period? Structurally,
I think,
financially?
Well, I like thinking about the structure of how our government works, and I think 2 different things happened, and I think it's debatable. People can debate whether they were good or they were bad. But the university system became a highly independent entity under the new Constitution, and it took away the ability of the legislature to have some level of oversight, and others would say to meddle with it. The legislature could no longer meddle. Funding has increased, though I think the proportionality of the funding to private funding has actually flipped over that period of time. So some people would argue that that was a good thing. Some people will argue that that independence was not. I personally think it was a good thing. In terms of primary and secondary education in the olden days, I think the biggest significance was that the VOTEC centers were actually under the Board of Public Education, which is the K through 12
They were
system.
part of K through 12.
They were part of K
instead
through
of the
12.
upper, higher education.
And after an interim study and some work, it was determined that they really have a closer relationship to the university system, more as a gateway to the university system or a complement to the university system. So systemically that changed. I happen to think too that was a good change for all.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So.
When it comes to K-12, I think there was progressive funding throughout the 70s without a doubt. We ran into sort of a glitch. In 1981, Republicans controlled the House of Representatives and gave a double-digit increase in the foundation program. And when Ted Schwinden was governor the next year and Dan Kimmis was Speaker of the House, we found there was no money left, even though one of our good friends, Ray Peck, introduced a bill that was 12 and 12. That's a 12% increase per year, but there was no money for that. We ended up shortly thereafter robbing what we'd call the Education Trust Fund
Mm-hmm.
to try to keep the funding going. It got progressively worse for K-12, and I remember a special session in 1989. Mike Cadis, who was a former, he was a legislator then, but he was later a mayor of Missoula, was our man to do the negotiation. Jack Ramirez was the Republicans' man to do the negotiation. It was a special session, I remember, in '89, and that same session not only reformed the way we funded schools, they gave oil and gas companies a tax break during that special session. That's what I remember. In '92, we were strapped for money. 91, 92 session. We did our best. Stan Stevens was governor, and the budget was broken there.
The 90s saw a bathtub in terms of the line of
support. I was just getting there because we started putting less and less money relatively into schools. And if you look at the chart of school funding, you will see a bathtub-like effect that we did in the 90s. Now, 90s, remember, was a national recession. And states started cutting taxes. The states that were in the worst trouble cut taxes actually the most. And it took quite a while to come out of that. Of course, then there was a school funding lawsuit filed that was upheld and ended up being resolved under Governor Schweitzer.
Well, the bottom line of this thing was that I think that there was a philosophical commitment to doing more with education, to restructuring it, putting more money into it. That hasn't held for the full 40 years. It's kind of frittered away now and then we get it back again. Again, I think we pulled out of the bathtub in the last decade or so.
That's right. Now, one other point though. Indian education for all was something that had been promised in the Constitution.
Yep.
And that also did not occur until just recently, a recent governor.
Now, you mentioned the Education Trust Fund being robbed. Let's talk about another trust fund, the Coal Tax Trust Fund. How meaningful was that? It was 1976, was it?
It's when it was passed by the voters, yes, adopted.
And now approaching $1 billion, that is the interest therefrom is being used to and that's only half the money goes into it, and half gets spent.
Right.
But the half that goes into it's now almost $1 billion, and that has created all this appropriation authority for years and years and years of interest to be spent. What's your take and your reflection of has that been a good success? Was it something that we should have done?
You take that one.
One of the smartest things the state of Montana ever did was create that coal severance tax trust fund, the permanent fund. At certain times during the 80s and during the 90s, just the interest off of this funded a large portion of our budget. The interest exceeded $80 million in some bienniums. You know very well, because you helped me pass a bill called the Treasure State Endowment. And we set aside a part of that permanent fund to build infrastructure for needy cities and counties, drinking water, sewer,
and bridges.
And we added bridges later on.
Yeah.
And it's been a political football. There are some people in the legislature, there always are, that don't like the state having that sort of, trust fund. But boy, it sure means something for our bottom line. And were we ever to tap that, we should be looking at bond ratings and making sure. In the meantime, we continue to use that as our main infrastructure program in the state of Montana.
Whenever the legislature gets around to passing infrastructure.
When they get around to passing.
Which
Goodness
they've been a little bit
gracious.
short in the last couple sessions.
Yes.
Let me go to taxation for a minute. And the driving political issue of the early years of this period was the sales tax. 67, big sales tax battle. House passes it, Senate says no. Tim Babcock, the governor, says, I think the Senate was wrong. All those Democrats in the Senate were wrong. I'm going to run hard on this in 68. He ran against Forrest Anderson, who said pay more, what for, and kind of cleaned Tim's clock, beating an incumbent governor by that much. It was pretty clear where the Montanans were on the sales tax. So in 69, there was no sales tax in the legislature, but it popped up again in 71, ended up on the ballot. 70% of the people voted against it. The Republicans were so associated with it, it really put them behind the 8 ball politically for a decade. The very decade we're talking about here. So the sales tax was a big, big force during that period of in terms of taxation, and it kind of set a tone. Since that time, there's not been a sales tax, so there's been one effort to reenact it, to do it in 93, was turned down by the voters again, 70%. I think that's kind of established where it is. But that taxation, one of the places where the sales tax had some appeal was to local government, which was historically left without resources by the legislature. However, the local government did get some things improved by this period of change. I wonder if we could talk about what local government got out of it. There was some constitutional change. We called it mixed bag in ours because there was a lot of promise, but you were a local government practitioner. What were the hallmark of what came out of that thing from your perspective? Self-governing powers? Or?
You just did a really quick switch from taxation to local government, I think. But let me take the local government stuff first, and then we can go back to taxation if you want. Again, the new Constitution really took a good, long, hard look at local government, and I think said a couple of things. One is, it would be a really good exercise if people in their communities looked at their local government every now and then, and therefore they had a provision where by every 10 years people would vote on whether they wanted to retain their current form of government or to study. I guess the question was whether they wanted to study their local government. Over time, I think people have lost kind of interest in that, but it's a really good thing. I mean, it's a good thing for people to think about. The second thing is it gave local governments some local government powers, if the local government wanted to adopt them, self-government powers, and if they were approved by their voters. So they didn't impose anything, But particularly, I think at the municipal levels, they tried to give cities and towns some flexibility.
And some consolidation opportunities too.
Some consolidation, especially for counties like county consolidations or consolidating with, like Butte-Silverbow is a good example.
I think Butte and Anaconda both did
Butte and
city-county
Anaconda did.
consolidation.
I think Madison County
did something.
and I'm not quite sure if they've undone it or not, but that's okay too.
Yeah,
But-
I think they got rid of their municipalities and have just one government.
I think so.
Yeah, and Butte and Anaconda did. There may have been some unfulfilled promise in that, but people have the right to review. They have self-governing
Yep.
powers.
And I think all that's good.
And you were a practitioner in that.
I was a practitioner at the county level
Mm-hmm.
on the county commission, and then subsequently as chief administrative officer for the county for about 10 years. And what is true, and this gets back to the taxation issue, is one of the things that the legislature or the CONCON withheld from the counties was any ability to raise revenue
Right.
outside of a very, very small dependence on property taxes.
And the legislature still has not let go of that.
The
to
legislature
degree.
still holds that pretty tightly. I personally think that there's a plethora of options that could be used and I'm perfectly okay with referring those questions to the voters and letting them decide.
And there's been a lot of that. There's some forms of it in a different way, but basically, most politicians are afraid to raise taxes these days. But if the taxes are the price of a civilized society. I mean, really, when you get down to it, and they're the opportunity to make decisions and do things if you want to do them collectively. But local government was kind of a mixed bag in that period. But I think came out ahead compared to what it was before.
Oh, without any question.
You
And there have been times during the legislature where we've tried to improve on local government statutes. They're very, very, very complicated. You end up with a bill that's hundreds upon hundreds of pages long, and it always gets beat because it's just too complicated.
I always thought it was ironic that legislators, when they're elected by the electorate, think that the electorate is very enlightened when they elect them as legislators, but don't know what they're doing when they're electing local officials.
It's so ironic, isn't it?
Now, you were very involved, Anne Mary, in deinstitutionalization, and a hallmark of this period was what was done with institutions to eliminate warehousing and mistreatment and lack and neglect and so on, and make it more community-based. Was that something that kind of?
Well, it actually happened under the Judge administration. Right. And another little factoid is that my father and Tom Judge ran against each other for lieutenant governor, and Tom beat Dad, and then Tom became governor. So there's a little family history there. Another part of family history is my oldest sister was significantly developmentally disabled and was never institutionalized, lived in the family for all of her life. So a huge influence on me and my sisters. So when I came to the legislature, there had been a crisis at Boulder River School and Hospital, the state institution for the developmentally disabled. The governor had proposed one solution to fix it, and basically the developmental disabilities community said they didn't like that. Tom was great. He and the administration worked to basically help create a system of community-based services for folks with disabilities. Many people were brought out of Boulder and Galen into community-based services, which were all run by local not-for-profit corporations. A great model that I would say has worked 99% of the time. The only thing I would say is, unfortunately, that same system with mental health has never been fully developed.
And that's not just a Montana challenge, that's a national challenge.
That is an absolute national challenge. And it was a huge bipartisan effort also that made that work. I mean, the governor and his staff were terrific. We had bipartisan legislative leadership on the matter, and the public was very much involved. So in the end, I think a very, very successful change.
I'm going to take 2 seconds and mention an area, because time's running short here. It always goes so fast when we get in these wonderful conversations and about labor. Without question, workers gained during this period. Remembering this was a situation where total corporate dominance was removed, the copper collar was removed, workers which had to struggle outside of government to get their things done, say with their negotiations with the Anaconda Company or whatever. Public employee collective bargaining occurred, a workers' compensation system was reformed, there were expansions in terms of unemployment compensation. There was a lot of job training activity that went on, and there were a lot of things that happened with labor during that period that were rather significant for workers, weren't they?
Well, absolutely. And, you know, this was happening at a period when a number of other states around us were becoming right-to-work states.
Mm-hmm.
And Montana resisted that, and I think without a doubt because of the kind of working together that a number of citizen groups had, not just labor, Farmers
Coalition,
Union, Native Americans, League of Women Voters,
the
people
religious
interested in
community.
good, absolutely the churches, Association of Churches lobbied, and it was fairly easy for these people to come together on a number of these bills. What you might call environmentalists today supported workers' rights,
Mm-hmm.
and vice versa. And I mean, with some discrepancies, but for the most part, these were citizen groups that were working together. You know, they weren't, they didn't have radical edges on them at that point, and I don't remember the kind of labeling that we have now. Now we have labels. Conservative means something, liberal means something. Back in those days, we didn't call people environmentalists for quite a while. And, you know, I guess you called them a communist. Maybe that was the worst thing you could say. And they called Mike Mansfield a communist, so that's...
I think they were tree huggers or some crazy thing, you know.
Well, it is interesting that how that thing has evolved, but you know, we are really rapidly running out of time, and I just need an extraordinarily short comment about your thoughts about participating in this era.
Thank you for asking me to be here today. The discussion has reminded me about thinking about our commitment for the future. I think truly that's what this era was about, was thinking about the future, the coal tax, the environmental laws, changes in structure. And I sit here today hoping that the millennials out there will take advantage and do what we tried to do. It's their turn now. I mean, we were in our late 20s and 30s when we did this. We did the best we could. That was then, this is now, and I think it's their turn, and good luck and more power to them.
Al?
People these days, especially young people, have the opportunity to have more knowledge and information than this world has ever seen. Please, when elections roll around, take time to, from your busy schedules, study the issues and think about what Anne Mary said. Think about what this state is going to look like. This state has its entire future to look forward to. This state can be the Shangri-La that the world has always sought, as long as we make smart decisions.
Thank you both for joining us.
Thanks,
and
Evan.
what you said here at the close, I think, gives a sense of mission to younger generations of Montanans. Get in, make a difference for your own future, and don't let it be determined by others.
Yeah.
So as we look back on the last, from 40 years ago to in the crucible of change, thank you for participating, and we'll see you the next time.